Welcome everyone to the Moisky News for January 20th, 2020. Today I want to talk about one of the newest MPs to join the House of Commons, whose name is Zarah Sultana. She took over from Jim Cunningham, who at the 2017 general election had a 8,000-seat majority, something he actually had for the majority of his political career, which was 27 years in the House of Commons. He wanted to retire. And for those who don't know who Jim Cunningham is, well, he's kind of unremarkable as far as his career goes. The two most notable things about him were that during the expense scandal he was one of the lowest expense claimers, and unlike the other two Coventry MPs, he did not try to back a second Brexit referendum. So back to Zarah Sultana. When a new MP gets to make their maiden speech, it is seen as an opportunity for them to look good and tell us what they are all about. There are a number of traditions that 99.999999% of MPs have adhered to. So, for example, one does not attack any party. Someone should have told Zarah that in advance, I think, because that's what she did. I'm not going to play the clip of it. I wrote down I was going to, but no, I'm not going to do that. Basically, she blasted 40 years of Thatcherism, which would include, of those 40 years, 13 years of a Labour government. Right, so firstly, what is Thatcherism? Thatcherism is privatisation, essentially. I know I've dumbed it down massively, but I'll be honest, overcomplicating something as simple as that seems redundant. Next, we need to look at what was privatised under which government. For this to be true, under Margaret Thatcher, as we all know, would include British Airways, British Telecom, British Steel and British Gas. Privatisation was in fact a popularised term under Thatcher, hence Thatcherism. The intention being that it would cut the costs to the taxpayer to sell off our assets so that private companies could instead dictate terms to us. Fantastic. It's interesting to note that we still subsidise a number of these, and thanks to privatisation with things like British Telecom, we have really bad internet in this country. Seriously, it's horrific. And as far as British Steel goes, yeah, well, that's a dying industry anyway, but yes, they're all going under anyway. British Gas seems okay for the time being, as does British Airways, although it's a miracle that we still fly. Under John Major, the most notable thing to be privatised under the Railway Act 1993 was, well, our railways. Now, there were a number of issues with this and reasons for it. Actually, it can be traced back to EU rules, much like with water in this country. We had to obey certain terms as being members of the EU. Us owning the railways and all of it doesn't work under EU rules. So basically, the operations of the BRB were broken up and sold off, with various regulatory functions being transferred to a newly created office of the Rail Regulator. It should be noted, at that time, Michael Heseltine was also attempting to privatise the post office, but it was abandoned due to public opposition and resistance from backbenchers, fearful of an electoral wipeout. Well, they certainly knew what was coming, didn't they, in the form of Tony Blair. New Labour, under Tony Blair, made an electoral capital out of the Tories' unpopularity, and only pledged to stop the sell-off of air traffic control. But this was betrayed. The major privatisation policy introduced in this period of 1997 to 2001 was a compromise between a managerial leadership and Labour's electoral base known as the Private Finance Initiative, pioneered by Norman Lamont and introduced to the London Underground, the NHS and schools. The policies raised money in the short term without the need for higher taxes, with Peter Mandelson believing that the role of government was to foster entrepreneurial culture. Under Labour, Royal Mail and the NHS were partially privatised, and a lot of it came from high costs of PFI initiatives affecting the NHS fiscally, and it did not dampen the problem. And it wasn't until the credit crunch and the ensuing problems that arose from it that that particular pendulum began to swing in the opposite direction, which led to Brown nationalising somewhat belatedly a number of failing banks, Northern Rock being the most notable. RBS, yes, another. We bought a lot of shares in that. That was a mistake. With the intention being, as I remember, to then reprivatise them as soon as possible. I mentioned earlier during Blair that Royal Mail was being sold off. Well, it was actually during the time of Cameron. Large sectors of education and NHS were also partially privatised and reformed under academies. In short, because apparently I've dawdled long enough, all governments have privatised in some manner. Many believed that Tony Blair did nothing like that. Well, even lifetime fans of the Labour Party like Owen Jones, who's probably not much of a fan of Tony Blair to be honest because of the war stuff, concedes that Tony Blair sought to privatise. He, Tony Blair, is, after all, a renowned entrepreneur and philanthropist. Have I long enough? My apologies. In short, Zarah Sultana is right. She was right to blast 40 years of privatisation because of the position and the mandate she stands on. To be clear, I don't really agree with her wholeheartedly. There are a number of public services or services that should be publicly owned. Not all of them. I don't believe that would be right. Can you imagine the hassle now of dealing with British Steel when we're still subsidising the rails? When we're still subsidising companies that help with our NHS? I can't be bothered. She was backed by a number of MPs for the claims she made. One most notably would be Angela Rayner, who is running for deputy leader of the Labour Party. I actually don't mind Zarah Sultana being as vocal as she is, because we are now reaching a moment where new names, new voices, new personalities need to come forward. As this current shadow cabinet is reshuffled, many of the most prominent characters won't feature in whoever runs it next. If it is Rebecca Long-Bailey, chances are many will actually stay. It'll probably become more female, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if it becomes the character of the party, then they've got an issue. If it is Keir Starmer, no one knows, because even he won't align with Corbyn or Blair. He won't outright say it anyway. But if it is Keir Starmer, I can see many of the current shadow cabinet being sent to the back benches. So it is quite interesting. Now I should point out, while Blair has been pummeled for the PFI nonsense, he did pledge a lot of money during his time in office to the NHS. However, his inability to count money and ridiculous borrowing renders the entire point of pumping extra money into the NHS moot, because the NHS had to suffer for a very long time before anyone could start putting money back into it again. That's not me crediting the Conservatives, it's me saying, I think we suffered long enough for your big mistake. There are a number of articles doing their rounds, focusing on Zarah Sultana as a person, because she has what many have deemed a controversial Corbynista history, with her, for example, in November being forced to apologise for saying she would celebrate the deaths of Tony Blair and Benjamin Netanyahu. This coming from a 2015 university student post where she said, "Try and stop me when the likes of Blair, Netanyahu and Bush die." And in another post, declaring that she couldn't believe that a Jewish woman, this Whitey, which is spelt YT like YouTube, but pronounced as if white person, thinks she can represent us, this being in relation to an ethnic minorities officer election, where she celebrated that the white woman didn't win it. Right. Well, I hope you stay more vocal within the party, and I actually look forward to seeing how you do over the next 5 years. Hopefully, Miss Sultana, you'll be an incredibly entertaining character.